This episode is brought to you in part by Museum of the Bible and its new worship experience, All Creation Sings, made in partnership with Creator. Step into an immersive room with vibrant visuals, soundscapes of praise, and interactive displays illuminating the story of worship. Get tickets at museumofthebible.org/ACS.
I could not care for my mother like a superwoman. I had to learn to do it as a well woman. In learning this, I had to slow it down. And there were things mom still could do for herself. My initial was to take it on and do it for her. And she's like, no, I can help you. I'm going to help you in this. So again, it was the message through this of we can care for others, but we have to do it in a way that we also care for ourselves and we don't harm ourselves.
This is Where You're From, an origin story podcast at the intersection of faith and culture that digs into the influences and experiences that shape who we are today. Join us as we gain insight into the Bible's wisdom for all, regardless of where we're from. Hey y'all, this is Rasul Berry. Thanks for joining me on Where You're From. This week, I want to share my conversation with Dr. Jeanne Porter King. Dr. Porter King serves as the executive pastor at Christ Community Church in South Holland, Illinois, along with her husband, Dr. Carl King Sr., the senior pastor. She also is the founder and principal consultant of the Transporter Group Incorporated and has over 30 years of consulting and training experience. Dr. Porter King is the author of several books, including her latest, Caring Well, 90 Self-Care Devotions for the African American Caregiver, which is part of the Voices collection at Our Daily Bread Ministries. Please join me as I ask Dr. Jeanne Porter King where you're from.
I am from small towns in eastern Ohio, western Pennsylvania, on the Ohio River, the tri-state area, Ohio, West Virginia, Pennsylvania. And I have to say it that way because that really was the community. So my first 11 years of my life, we lived in Midland, Pennsylvania, 40 miles north of Pittsburgh, small mill town, very just family-oriented, community-oriented. And then at 11, going into my 7th grade year, my parents moved down the street, I call it, but across the border to East Liverpool, Ohio. Different experience, but still in those small towns in the Ohio River Valley.
Okay, now paint us a picture of what it was like growing up in that context. What was family like for you?
Oh, excellent question. My first memories go back to 2 places in Midland, Pennsylvania, maybe the first 4 years of my life. My parents, when they married, actually moved in to help take care of my mother's mother. She was a widow and was raising 3 of her grandchildren, and my mother was living with her to take care of them. So my father moved in, had extra room, and that's where I remember just the extended family and cousins and my granny. And by age 4, my father moves us out to Midland Heights. And that was a community in Midland in which you had these 2 apartment buildings. We had a 3-bedroom townhouse, and there would have been 6 buildings, and then across the parking lot was another building with 6 units. In that entire complex, there was probably 100 of these units. They only put the blacks in those 2. We didn't even know we were segregated. My mother says that it was the best time of her life, raising her children with my aunties, the uncles. You had community. And we played kickball. It was intergenerational. With the older kids hung out with us. And we didn't have to worry so much about the street lights because we only had one street. It was the parking lot. So that was such a memorable time. Then when we moved to Ohio, the Ohio side, the reason I say that is so different, both communities probably only had about 5% blacks. It was a very white part of the country, as you may know. But the Ohio side felt a little more, I don't even know how to call it. It was just different. And in the same way, we moved to East End, which would have been more diverse, but it is predominantly where all of us Black kids lived, and we commuted and walked to school together. So again, you have this kind of pattern of diversity, but still some segregation.
So, I noticed that you mentioned that your mom said that just raising you and being in this community with her extended family was one of the best times of her life. So what prompted her to move to Ohio?
I think it was a combination of things. My mother, this gentle, kind soul, one of 9 children, and she was so close to her natural sisters, and then just made all these girlfriends. So it was an idyllic time for them. But as life changed, number one, their economics changed. People would classify us as working class. My father worked in what was called the refractories. We called it the brickyard. So all the big mills were there, and he worked in a feeder industry to the mills. So some of it was the economics that changed, but ultimately I really believe it was my granny, who was down in the other part of the town, still raising her 3 children. She had a stroke on watch night service at her church. She was the pastor, my first pastor. And ultimately, she came to live with us, as did one of my cousins. The story is when Granny was healing from the stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage, they called it, in the nursing home, she'd walk away. She was trying to get to the family. And my mother tells the story. My dad said, "Marge, your mother can come live with us. Bring her in." And they made these arrangements, bought a home where we all could stay. The grandchildren that my granny had been taking care of went to their mother. And my granny lived 2 years with us, and my mother was the caregiver. So that was modeled for me. Again, that extended family.
And I know, having lived with my grandmother, who I was very close with, she lived to be 101 before we lost her. That kind of intergenerational community and bond, it touches and impacts everybody, right? Even to the extent that she would leave while she's convalescing someplace else and says, "I got to make my way back to my family." That says a lot about how close you guys were. Did you have siblings growing up as well?
I am the oldest of 3, and my brother is 19 months younger than me, so we were extremely close. To this day we are. And then my sister is almost 10 years younger than me. At 10 years old, 11 years old, I'm helping to care for my baby sister. And so needless to say, I'm extremely close and a little maternal with her. She's older now, obviously, but yeah, we're very close. And that's something my mother just really stressed to us, that we'd always have family, and that's who we needed to be able to count on. And my father was one of 9, and my mother was one of 9. So we also have like a huge extended family of cousins that we were raised almost like siblings.
So I'm curious, because it seems like there's a bit of a contrast between this incredibly tight, interwoven family dynamic in which you're experiencing all this affirmation, love, support, intergenerationally from grandmom to cousins. And then you talk about this outside world where you go to school or you experience kind of the realities of Midwestern race dynamics. Tell us about how you first became aware. Oh, wait a minute. Not everybody treats me or sees me like my family does.
I remember as early as kindergarten, first grade, beginning to notice the differences. And I was blessed to have great teachers, and Midland wasn't as bad. It was really East Liverpool began to, just the whiteness of the area was a stark contrast. You began to just note some differences. Often I was the only Black person. This is once I got to Ohio. I just didn't remember experiencing it in the Pennsylvania side. Maybe because it was a smaller town. We often said in the Pennsylvania side, you had so many immigrants themselves, people whose people had migrated from Eastern Europe. So we were all kind of this conglomerate of difference, if you will. We just kind of dealt with it differently. East Liverpool and the Ohio side felt a little more like what I now know as the structural racism, was more pronounced and prominent.
I want to lean into that a little bit, because it's an interesting contrast that you draw between the Pennsylvania side, where the immigrant dynamic kind of creates a scenario in which the politics and perspectives and the history of how they see race, if they're from Eastern Europe, they're from Poland or someplace else, they're kind of a different history than someone on the Ohio side that may been born and been in the U.S. for generations. You mentioned the phrase, it just felt white. So I'm curious if you to unpack what that meant for it to feel white.
So by the time you get to high school, for instance, the music that would have been played at the school parties. And I have a very eclectic taste of music because of my background, but it felt white. The cheerleaders, we may have had one black cheerleader. Athletics were different. My brother was a star on the basketball and football team, and all his friends were my friends. But down to the parties, the songs, who was touted, the beauty aesthetics. And to the extent that when we were graduating, my girlfriends cried they were going to miss this place. And I just remember thinking, I can't wait to get away from here. I ended up getting full rides once I got to Ohio State. But I went to Ohio State because I felt I needed to continue to navigate this world. The business world I saw that I was going to go into was going to be white, and I need to navigate it. And I thought it was so ironic that though I felt this whiteness, I did not feel compelled to leave it in the ways that my girlfriends ended up going to HBCUs.
Yeah, that is an interesting observation, and I can also relate to it. Here's my take, and you give me your insight on your perspective on this. I feel like there's kind of a multiple, almost like a fight or flight response that we can adapt when we grow up in a certain cultural environment where there are certain people who might be more prone to, I want to figure this out and understand it so I can thrive in it, right? So I'm going to fight. But there are folks that are like, I got to get out of here as soon as possible and get to the most opposite situation so I don't have to deal with this kind of difficulty again. You know, and I think if you're intellectually curious, there's almost this sociological instinct that can kind of kick up that says, I want to understand it so then I can respond to it and maybe even correct it. What do you think about that?
I think that is so insightful because I think that's what I did. As a matter of fact, I was in the engineering program, but all of my basic electives were Black studies. And my friends thought I was this radical sis. Back in the day, I had my afro. One of my football colleague friends said, you are just so radical when it comes to Blackness. I just don't understand it. And he came from a conservative church, so he didn't quite get it. But my dad, I often tell people, was the most brilliant man I knew. But because of economics, they grew up poor. He didn't get to go to college. He knew that education was going to be the key, but he had still this critical thinking in me. And now as you unpack that, I think that fits. Not only did I want to master it, but maybe find ways to change it, to make it better for others. I felt we, as Black people growing up in Western Penn and especially in Eastern Ohio, I felt we understood that broader world. But friends of mine who were European American, they did not understand or try to enter into my world. It's almost like W.E.B. Du Bois talks about that double consciousness and going inside the veil and outside the veil. We live that. You
know, I'm glad that you added that component because one of the things that you write about in your works and that you think about is not just the racial lens, but also the intersectionality between race and gender. And you talk about your brother who, through sports, kind of had an end to navigate some of those surroundings and even find a sense of celebration, validation through that. Looking back on that same time period in high school, how do you think you see the dynamic, the interplay between you being not just Black, but also a woman in that space and how you may have experienced it differently in light of the two of those realities?
So I had this strong sense of both women's rights and civil rights. I probably did not bring the intersection together until I lived a little longer. And then looking back, began to see the differences, even with all the work I do in corporate around women's leadership development. For a while, I noticed that mostly white women benefited from the work aimed at gender equality. And I get stories around how Black women were still left out.
What I'm picking up is that almost like the stage of play, if you think about it, is all of us in high school, you're trying to figure out where you can fit in, where you can get this sense of affirmation. It feels like the state of play was primarily, and again, I know a little bit about the Midwest, football is king, right? So there's a place for the men to make a name for themselves, or the boys on the team. The whole community surrounds itself around this event of the sport. And then you have the women that are being the cheerleaders in this context that you talk about, which they're not the main event, but they can still find a sense of their own sense of validation by being there and kind of being picked in that way. But then you see, even in that context, apart from just two, that there's this aspect where do the Black women fit into this place of being able to find that same sense of validation and value? It just feels like it just keeps shrinking in terms of the opportunities to have that same sense of support, validation, etc.
Exactly. And for me, we had our good girlfriend group, but my validation, support, and affirmation for who I was really came from my church, which was my extended family. I tell people, small Black Pentecostal church in the Midwest. Of the 35 members, 27 were my relatives, right? That was my affirmation.
Right.
I was not the athlete my brother was. So I played volleyball and basketball. Rasul, by junior year, I realized, look, this is not you. You're good, but you're not the star athlete. So I focused on my books.
Yeah.
In chemistry class, the higher level maths, pre-calc, et cetera, I was always the only Black girl. And if there was a question, I was going to be the one that asked the question. I remember Mr. Martin, and he said, we don't often see girls that are this good in math. You should really consider studying engineering. And I was like, really? And went home and told my dad, and because he worked in manufacturing, that's how I ended up getting to school and getting it financed eventually. One of the schools I wanted to look at was University of Cincinnati. So I had to take this, I don't know if it was an aptitude test or an intellect, I don't even remember. But when I got the feedback, the examiner said, when we look at this, you would not make a good engineer. You should probably be in something like the social services, helping people. Rasul, I made up my mind at that point that this white man was not going to tell me that I could not become an engineer. I heard it as I didn't have the aptitude. I now realize in the work that I do was probably a career interest inventory. And after getting 2 degrees in engineering, he was absolutely right. I lasted 7 months as an engineer. I love the problem solving. I thank God for the training. It gives me an analytical mind. I ended up in ministry. But again, because of this fight, as you called it earlier, I resisted those things. And so I was going to prove that I had the aptitude to get this engineering degree.
I want to turn back because you talked about the importance of your faith community and the church. Tell us a little bit about your own faith journey and, what you recall about the kind of foundation that those experiences had for you.
Oh, yes. I was raised in the church, and my earliest memories are of my granny being our pastor, a woman leading. She was a powerful preacher and singer. When my dad, from as early as us living on Midland Heights, he'd take me to church. And I remember as early as 4 or 5 years old, he'd bring me back. And I'd say, oh, Dad, I want to stay in church all the time. It was just an affirming, supportive place of hope and love for me. I was baptized very early, so that belief and faith was instilled as early as 7. Coming from the Pentecostal tradition, I had that additional experience of the Holy Spirit at 14. And so consequently, my faith journey started very early. And because we were a conservative Pentecostal church, I tell people I have entire gaps in my cultural memory of certain songs. We had to give up songs. We had to put our records away.
Holiness is right. It's still right. So you got to get right.
That's it. I didn't get to my junior or senior prom. I remember I got saved, if you will, December 22nd of my freshman year in college. We had a sweetheart dance in February. I was nominated for the court. Do you know I had to turn that down? But that was in those days. That was your witness of giving all to the Lord. I obviously don't see it that way now. But I tell people there were some things in my faith background that today I critique. But that discipline, that reverence for the word, for holiness, I appreciate that being part of my foundation and my formation.
Yes.
Obviously have gravitated since gotten, seminary degree from a Presbyterian seminary, and tell people that I minister, speak, and teach in all denominations.
Right.
But I'm grateful for that foundation.
There's something about being saved, sanctified, fire baptized, and filled with the Holy Ghost. The blood still works, like they say.
The blood still works.
So no, I appreciate that. And on top of that, though, now you can wear pants and earrings.
And face paint.
So you decide to go to the Ohio State University. Tell us about that. You're this academic, you have an intellectual bent, and now you are in a university setting, one of the biggest schools in the country. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, at the time, it was the largest in the world in one place.
Yeah.
55,000 students at the time I went there, which meant it was 3 times larger than East Liverpool that I grew up in.
Wow.
But they had a very nice system. Fabulous, fascinating time in my life, meeting people of all ethnic and cultural backgrounds. So again, coming from where I did in a quote unquote cultural minority, it was fascinating to get the cultural diversity. Ended up getting connected with the Black Undergraduate Engineering Council. I became a tutor, but I discovered so much about myself. I enjoyed meeting people. I ended up probably not being as close to the church as I should have in that first year. There I discovered the brothers at a whole nother level. And so I had some fun that first year. I went back to visit the church. People would have to come get me. And there was a man preaching. It was a guest preacher. And he had one of those messages that just penetrated my heart, that basically the Lord is calling you back. So I'm like really listening and taking this message personally. And then freshman year, I was coming down one of the steps, and there was this young lady sitting on the steps, filling out her schedule. Ended up meeting each other, found out we both came from the Apostolic Pentecostal faith tradition. So we connected. About a week later, I see her again on campus. And I go up to her and I say, "Hey, it's good seeing you again." And she looks at me kind of like, "Do I know you?" And I'm thinking, "What's this about?" I said, "Well, we met last week." And then it hits her. She goes, "Oh, you probably met my twin sister, Carol." And her name was Carla.
Wow.
The 3 of us became amigas. They went to a larger, almost a mega church in Columbus. And they got me involved. I got in the choir. We traveled. We'd go to Detroit and sing. So in between me getting my work done, I had another community, so much so that by the time I graduated, I ended up being president of the young people. I got so involved in that church. And then the state organization that was a part of it. And that was what kind of brought me back into the disciplined, structured faith community.
That's great. So I'm hearing what that moment of college meant, a discovery of yourself, your awareness of not just an appreciation of your own culture, but of others, just the diversity that's there on that campus in general. I see leadership skills coming out, you know what I mean? You just kind of, that's a part of what you do. But again, I think it's really helpful to hear maybe what were the specifics that prompted you and others that joined this group to feel the need to make space for yourself in a way that you weren't able to fully be yourself.
It was just that support that if you're going to get through a program of this nature, you cannot do this on your own. And that to me is a life lesson for even this day with the women's leadership training that I do, with cultivating cohorts, that you've got to be collaborative and you've got to have a support system, because no one, it may look like people make it on their own as individual leaders. There are no Lone Ranger leaders that are successful. You've got to have that support system.
So you get your degree in engineering, and I guess as what most people do when they get a degree from a school, you go into the field, and then what happens? and when you realize, wait, this may not be for me.
I landed my first job as a logistics engineer with Ross Laboratories. I was designated to create this inventory control system that would help the warehouse and the sales team and the marketing team know what their pamphlets were to educate mothers on Similac and others. There was parts of the job in which I had to serve as kind of project management, lead person to bring these executive men together. And I remember one meeting, they were just in there yelling at each other. No, we need this. And I'm like, is this the Twilight Zone? What am I doing here? So something kicked in, and I said, my Joe Porter spirit, that was my dad. I said, wait a minute, I brought order to that room. And that was one of the most fascinating parts of the role, was bringing these older men together and getting, specifications for this system. So that, again, that kind of leader emerged and we navigated it. So the other part of the project is then I had to design, had to code and develop the system. I was horrible. I could code worth nothing. As a matter of fact, I'd get sleepy at the laptop and I'd have to get up, and I made friends in the other departments. I'd go check in on them. And then obviously I learned the system and then had to train and teach the users of the system. And that was the calling. I was supposed to be training and teaching. And it started out in technical training. I left after that project, recognizing this was not for me, because it was easier to get back into Ohio State. I had such a great reputation. I went back into the program. I was accepted, fellowship, basically scholarship, to get a master's in the major. But because it was my undergraduate major, I only had so many courses that I needed to take the major. So I had all these other credits that I could take anything. And I did all my other courses in org behavior and IO psychology. And that's how I got into this field of organizational development, leadership training, team development. And that's what I did for like 8 years until I went back to get my doctorate.
So at some point, you add to the engineering, to the communications, and then ministry. What prompted you to see, okay, I want to kind of tie these thoughts together of communication, of helping people understand diversity and culture with the faith component?
Shortly after I graduated as an undergraduate, the Lord really got my attention and I accepted. And so in my tradition, that Pentecostal tradition I grew up in, I was doing both things. I continued in this corporate track, and then I was in this ministry track. Did some Bible college, got the internal training that they had, gravitated into ministry leadership for the youth and young adult ministries at the local church, the district organization, the state, and gravitated into leadership at the same time. So I, at one point, was the second woman in like a 40-year history of leading this, what was called the Ohio District Council Young People's Union. I was the vice president for like 6 years, and then the president left, and that's when I went to do my doctorate. So it was always a parallel path. It's just the way we lived it out. You were called, you had to go get a job, but you were called, so you preached and taught and you learned. But it was, once I got to Chicago, I did want to go to seminary, and I wanted to look at this from a theological. So I had social science and theology. And bringing those two together really served as kind of the foundation for what I do to this day in my writing, in my coaching programs, in my training. Even with my corporate training, it always had a spiritual or faith component. We may not have ever been able to use the God language, but for me, I may have called it like an ethical dimension to leadership.
Yeah, I love that, the connecting with the ethical, and even just the importance of seeing you had an integrated view and perspective of the world and of life, where your faith was informing your worldview across the board. So even if that was in a boardroom, or if that was at the office or in the classroom, you saw those things as an integrated whole.
One of my books, the subtitle is about a holistic leadership. I'm unpacking that even more because it's exactly what you said. This journey has shown me the integrated nature of life.
When we come back, Dr. Jeanne Porter King will dive into her personal journey of loss, how that journey related to her trying to be a superwoman, and how all of that was shaped by the unique way race, ethnicity, and gender has impacted her life. That's coming next on Where You're From.
This is a paid message from Among the Pots and Pans, a unique theological cookbook that explores the connection between food and faith. Alex Early is a pastor who loves to cook, and he wants to show you how you can connect with God, love your neighbor, and nourish your community through the art of cooking. Alex shares some delicious recipes inspired by his family and friends, including smoked salmon with cilantro sauce, aged Gouda grilled cheese with sun-dried pesto, and this one is my favorite, shrimp tacos with holy guacamole, sanctified slaw, and screamin' sour cream. There are over 50 recipes in all. Alex also offers reflections on the role food plays in God's redemptive plan for his people, and how you can use cooking to reach out to loved ones and others in need of some good food and fellowship. Join Alex for delicious meals and plenty of food for thought on the holy work in the kitchen. Among the Pots and Pans is available wherever books are sold.
Hey y'all, before we get back to my conversation with Dr. Jeanne Porter King, I want to share a quick teaser from our next episode with Pastor Rich Velotis. This is where you're from.
My son Nathan, who's 9 years old, loves chicken nuggets and french fries. I mean, to this day, he'll eat other stuff. He has the rice and beans and the pizza and all that, but homeboy loves chicken nuggets and fries. And so there have been times where we've gone to some really nice restaurants and we're eating, we got the menu in front of us, and he just wants chicken nuggets and french fries. And I have to tell him, Nathan, look at the menu, look at the options before you. And he's just like, no, I'm all right. Just no ketchup, just chicken nuggets and fries. And when I think about a lot of Christians, and I don't say this with condescension, right. I think there's a lot of chicken nuggets and french fries Christians, that we have global historic theology and expressions of faith within Christianity. And lots of folks just want their tradition. I just want my chicken nuggets and french fries of my denomination, or chicken nuggets and french fries of my particular tradition. And I'm thinking, wow, there's a feast before you. There's something missing here.
Now let's get back to our conversation with Dr. Jeanne Porter King on Where You're From. In the book, Leading Well, you do this double entendre with the word well, where you have as an extended teaching point Jesus with the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman. Why is John chapter 4, Jesus' encounter with the woman at the well, why is that so significant to you in your own life?
Yeah, the more I studied her, and I'd heard that story preached so many times, but often I'd walk away feeling like she was kind of this hoochie mama that Jesus got straight. The more I looked at it, and now keep in mind, I'm also coming along with my own sense of Black womanhood, the intersection of gender and race. And when I looked at that story and said, oh, wait a minute, you have that intersection right there. When she says, I am a Samaritan woman, she really is making a statement that is both ethnic or racial and gender. As I began to look at the sociology of the context, if you will, she was an outsider in the culture of Jesus' day.
Absolutely.
And I saw the parallels with me and other Black women as being the outsiders in our dominant culture of this day. Her culture, the Samaritan culture at the time, and their understanding of Messiah and who Messiah was to be, you then begin to see many of the statements she makes to Jesus comes out of her cultural understanding. So when you put a cultural lens to it, much of what she says, are you greater than our father Jacob, for instance? She has a veneration and reverence for Jacob because they expected Messiah to come out of the lineage of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jews of Jesus' day expected Messiah to come out of the lineage of David. And of course, as I write, isn't it like God that he came out of both, right? I saw so many things, even when she asks about and navigates the question to worship. So where should we worship? I just began to see, number one, she was a curious, inquisitive woman of this ethnic background that in the story of salvation and God's love, Jesus intentionally went to Samaria, I believe, to incorporate them into his gospel mission. And he spends this time with this woman And it's the longest discourse in the Gospels Jesus has, the longest dialogue. And it just, to me, was so affirming that if he found her, he could find us as Black women. And what we bring to the table are gifts that, spending that time with the Lord, we bring out and can lead out of this just powerful resources that happen at the well.
Yeah, that's so rich. And it's so cool to see how your journey through leadership really embodies that. And then there's this new work we're here to talk about as well, which is caring well. Tell us about how the enterprise of caregiving, I mean, you talked about it early in your life, but like even later, as an adult, how that became first and foremost in your mind as something to lean into.
My father died at 64. My mother lived another almost 30 years as a widow. But she had the time of her life. One of her other sisters, whose husband had passed, they moved in together. The sister came and lived in the home we grew up in. Then they ended up buying a place. And the four of them back home, there was four sisters back in Midland, Pennsylvania. They'd go out to eat, have a good time. Eventually, the sisters began to pass. And we kept saying to Mom, you really probably should come live closer to where one of us lives. She didn't want to. This is where she grew up. It was her family church. It was her heritage. Her parents, this was their church. And we'd say, Mom, we have churches where we are. My brother lived somewhere else and I lived somewhere else. So long story short, she stayed as independent as she could. She lived in this senior building back in Midland, Pennsylvania. And after the last sister passed, she, for about another 2 years, continued on her own until my sister said, Mom really shouldn't live on her own anymore. And the dynamics of our family was such that maybe 10 years prior to that, my brother became her financial power of attorney, and I became the healthcare or medical power of attorney. My sister was there on the grounds. And if she had a medical emergency back home, I'd come in. I had the kind of job I could do it. This time, it wasn't about just coming in to see her. She needed to really come live with one of us. And we had those conversations, and she chose me. I'm the oldest. By this time, though, she had a number of medical conditions. Thankfully, she did not have dementia. There were no cognitive impairments. So she was a delight, and she was a sweet woman. So it was a delight, but she had a number of physical that it was a challenge sometimes. And we brought her in at the height of COVID. I was working from home. My husband's a pastor. Our church is across the parking lot. We live on the campus. We had to shut the church down. So it was all of these dynamics that caregiving was then added to the mix of this whole pandemic thing. She ended up in the hospital, and I remember thinking, oh my God, my mother took care of herself all these years, and then she comes to me, and I have to hospitalize her. We didn't know she had another issue. So long story short, when she came through that, maybe 3 days in the hospital, 2 weeks of rehab, we got her back. I happened to post on Facebook. At this point, I hadn't been posting because it's just, we're adjusting. I post testimony of Mom coming through this situation. And I'm amazed at the responses. I have people that, number one, say, oh, wow, I took care of my mother or my father, and I did it for this long, or I did it for that long, encouraging me. You'll be fine. You'll make it through, and this is a great testimony. Others would say, oh, my God, I'm in the thick of it right now. It's good to know someone else is too. And so I began to just post periodically. Sometimes I'd get a word from the Lord, something that maybe we had gone through, and just a word of encouragement. Again, the amount of responses was just, I needed that. I'm caring for my 95-year-old mother, and I needed to hear that today. And so finally, after about a year of this, I put a post out and says, I'm noticing that more of us are caring for our senior parents than I realize. Until you get into the mix, you don't realize how prevalent it is or how predominant it is. So I put a post out and said, I'd love to start a blog that I invite you as guests to share your caregiving story, and primarily around how you're caring for yourself as you're caring for your loved one. So for the first year, I had people lined up, and second year, same thing. I think it was after maybe about halfway through that first year, Katera Washington Patton reached out to my literary agent and invited us to propose on a book on caregiving. I was so excited. So we did, and they accepted it. And I planned to write this with Mom, and she passed before my Leading Well book was even published. I was actually finishing that book, and just that was the hardest thing to finish because she passed unexpectedly. Even though she had all these 15 ailments, we didn't expect this to happen. What I began to see with the caregiving was one of the tools I had used was journaling. I'd often either write or I'd post some of my experiences. So after everything cleared, got the last book out, we were marketing it, I began to just go through my journals, organize the Caring Well book around caring for spirit, soul, and body, a holistic approach to care. I began to just daily kind of meditate, pray. I'd go back and look at journals that I had written, and lo and behold, there was something there. So it became this marvelous testament to not just caring for her, but reflecting back. And to be honest with you, it became a very healing part of my grief journey in losing Mom, was writing this book and reflecting on the care for her and her stories and her joy. And it became just a very healing process for me.
The layers of these threads, the threads of your story just coming together. You started off talking about how your mom moved to Ohio to care for her mother, right? And that was what you grew up doing and seeing your mother do and model for you. And now you get to do it for her in her last moments of life, but then also bless others with it. So it's just a beautiful kind of full circle moment from a ministry standpoint. But I want to ask you this, because there's these two worlds that collide when you talk about leading well and the challenges of being an African-American woman in leadership, but then also the caregiving space. I just kind of in preparation was looking up some statistics that even though Black women make up just about 7% of the U.S. population, it's double that in terms of the caregiving population. So twice as likely to be caregivers. You write in Caring Well that caring for others is what we do as Black Christian women, right? So there's that piece. But then there's this other challenge that you also refer to about the strong Black woman trope that Dr. Shaniqua Barnes mentions. And she refers to it as the single greatest disorder that people don't talk about in our society is this strong Black woman syndrome, right? This pressure to feel like you have to do it all and be it all. Talk to us about how you think through those complexities. One, you represent a group that's most likely looked upon to be the caregiver and those cultural pressures. But then also you're trying to help people realize you can't be everything and do everything and trying to give people a sense of wholeness and well-being. How do you navigate all that?
It is complex. And what I came to was that's partly how I began to see caregiving as a type of leadership, because you're managing an entire process, leading even your loved one in their health journey, their medical journey. You're managing caregivers, nurses, doctors. You're just managing so much. And if you do it through the lens of the Superwoman trope, you will most likely die before the one you're caring for, or you will be so stressed that, again, it will have very detrimental effects. So what I've come to recognize is that, number one, caregiving is what's expected of us, but often it's also our loved ones often thrive better at home. The times that my mother was in the hospital or the nursing home, one time she had a 3-month stint in the nursing home, she was determined to get out, so she did what she was supposed to do. My mother-in-law, as another example, she did not thrive in the nursing home. So we often thrive better at home. Often in our communities, there is also an equity issue. Often people in our communities don't have the finances to put their loved ones in quality long-term care facilities. Okay, so we have all of that. So we've got to find ways that we can do a both and. We both care for our loved ones and care for ourselves. And that is partly what the devotions for caring well, because not only are they inspirational, there's some instruction in there also.
Yeah.
What I learned is I couldn't do it on my own. Secondly, we hired caregiving assistants so that I could continue to work. And it became kind of this collaborative. And I'm so thankful for Denise, who was my mother's care assistant with me. And we had a health care agency that worked with us. You've got to have a strong team. And I write about what I found in that period is 911 with Angela Bassett. You know that series?
Yes.
It was on Fox. Well, the first year, I had missed probably 3-4 seasons of it. But I found it while I was caring for my mother. In that first season, the storyline is around Abby, who is caring for her elderly mother, who turns her dining room into her mother's. We had turned our family room into my mother's living space. And after I'd get it, long days trying to work in between, I had caregivers who'd come from 9 to 12, and then they'd come back 6:30 to 9. So it gave me a break in between. I could work. And by the time the day was over, my husband would go to bed. I'd go into our little reading/prayer room, and I'd put on 911, and that was my me time. And obviously I had my devotions, I had my prayer time, but I used that as just a very practical way of saying I had to learn to integrate them both. I could not care for my mother like a superwoman. I had to learn to do it as a well woman. And so again, in learning this, I had to slow it down. And there were things mom still could do for herself. My initial was to take it on and do it for her. And she's like, no, I can help you. I'm going to help you in this. So again, it was the message through this of we can care for others, but we have to do it in a way that we also care for ourselves and we don't harm ourselves.
Yeah. And the thing that's so beautiful about that story is the person that you're caring for is also caring for you.
She was still caring for me.
And saying, hey, you're doing too much. You write this in one of the devotionals, The Faith of Our Mothers. Many of us hail from women who were strong Black women who cared for others, often at the expense of caring for themselves. The stereotypic superwoman persona will not help us as caregivers today. Being everything to everyone will burn us out. Yet there is another side of our mother's strength that we must embrace. The memories and images of faith-filled women who prayed and sang their way through caring will help us as caregivers. So why was that important for you to make sure that you got in there to help people care well?
Because one thing I think we can do now, we are more cognizant of not buying totally into this super woman or strong Black woman trope.
Right.
But I didn't want to have the pendulum go the other direction and we throw it out altogether. There's a strength.
Yeah.
Especially with my mother. I saw her in the 30 years living without my dad. I saw a strength in her. When she came to live with me, sometimes she struggled to walk, struggled to get in the bed, but I saw determination. I saw a strength in her. And I appreciated that. And it's that strength that I want us to be able to draw from also, that when we're caring for these same people, they deposited in something in us that we draw from. We don't have to mask up and be more than we're supposed to be, but we can draw from this inner strength that comes from that well of the Holy Spirit again, and from the cultural traditions that are given us, that we can draw from that.
Yeah.
And I did want to lift that up and not just throw out the strong Black woman.
This is kind of going backwards chronologically, but there was this other aspect on this theme of people caring for you well that you were torn about it. Tell us about that situation, because it just seemed like something that was a significant moment in your life.
After I finished my doctorate, I came to teach at DePaul. Now, I was the quintessential strong Black woman. I did it all. I did a doctorate in record time in Athens, Ohio. By the time I came to teach at DePaul, I probably was stretched and stressed and on the emotional brink of a breakdown. And I loved teaching and wonderful teaching reviews, loved my students, but there were other things about the academia that I came to it a little later, and there was some hoops jumping that I probably would have done in my 20s. But by mid-30s, and having been a successful corporate manager and leader, there's just some things it was not working. Plus, I was stretched. And so I ended up finding this organizational development job at this other place and left at the end of fall quarter, my second year. And that would have been January I started this job. My dad passed in February. So all of the people from the university, they didn't like that I was leaving. Of course, they were, what's going on? They are kind, and they call and they reach out. And one particular woman was a former nun. And as she called and checked on me, said, we heard about your father passing. Just want to, extend our sympathies, condolences, etc. And so I began to kind of unpack, I'm so sorry I left the way I did. Just was time for me to go. This wasn't working. And I think I was about to say, maybe I should come back. Because she stopped me because she's like, you are not in position to come back here. She said, an old Jesuit priest told me something one day about you've got to walk in peace. You've got to walk in peace. And Jeanne, right now, you're not walking in peace. And I said, you're right. And it was shortly after that I made up in my mind that I was going to, in the midst of the grief, and then on top of, again, work to finish this doctorate, go into this academic, move to Chicago. I was like, I went into therapy. I found a counselor. And we worked through some things. And in many ways, Dad's death gave me the permission to do it because, again, I come from a tradition that didn't look on counseling as something that we necessarily needed. And that was the start of part of the Leading Well journey. It was a wellness component that I incorporated. I had, another couple of stints in both academia and then another large-scale consulting practice after that. But I navigated the world differently. One of the things she brought out for me is that I had perfectionism tendencies. And I call myself a recovering perfectionist right now. I try to work for excellence, but that notion of trying to be perfect came out in these series of sessions that I had to give myself permission to step back from that. And this journey has been delightful. I love it that these last two books, this is my 8th book coming out, but these last two have this kind of intersection of well and wellness in it. And I believe that's where the Lord's leading me into, this notion of a holistic life and helping others a lot earlier than me learn this.
This is Where You're From. I'm Rasul Berry, and remember, it's not just about where you're at, it's also about where you're from. This show was produced by Ryan Clevenger, Lamaria Stevens, and Mary Jo Clark. I want to thank listeners Dorothy Reed and Linda Teal for their help in supporting and promoting Where You're From. Thanks, y'all. Lastly, I have to send a special thank you to our summer intern, Lamaria Stevens. You were an amazing asset to the show, and we're grateful for all of your support in creating episodes for the Where You're From podcast, and wish you well on your future endeavors. Where You're From is part of the Voices collection from Our Daily Bread Ministries.
This is a paid message from AG Financial. Your money, with the right financial partner, can grow the kingdom so others see Jesus more. Church loans, retirement, investments, insurance, and planned giving for both churches and individuals. Let's make it all count. AG Financial. We understand ministry, and we want to be part of yours. Connect your faith and finances at agfinancial.org/makeitcount.